It's a lockdown, or at least a lockout, on this bonus episode of NES Works. By patron request, we're going to step back this week and look at a bit of NES-related ephemera that goes far beyond the platform itself, namely the history and philosophy of console lockout technology. Video games are a business, of course, and a global business at that. International corporations treat their various overseas branches as separate entities to a degree, and that means they want to protect and isolate the profit streams of each of those entities to whatever degree they can. And when you get into licensing for games, whether that has to do with media properties, music royalties, or whatever is involved, you get into external corporations that demand the right to protect their respective entities as well. Capitalism is messy and confusing. So naturally, when the very first console to aspire to international success came along, Nintendo's family computer, it brought with it the concept of breaking its market into regions along national lines: Japan, America, and 2 European divisions. Other console manufacturers followed Nintendo's lead, and until recently, region locking has been an unavoidable and frequently frustrating fact of life for video games. Before Famicom, of course, there was no real consideration for region locks. Video games were siloed until the NES's launch in 1985, and the prospect of going global didn't really register. Not only was the industry a small fry in the late 70s and early 80s, third parties didn't exist until Activision split away from Atari and launched its first games in 1980. Up until that point, it was taken as a given that a console manufacturer would simply have total control over its platform. And look, the Atari 2600 didn't even make its way to Japan until after the Famicom had launched. The Japanese model, branded as the Atari 2800, didn't arrive until October 1983, by which point the hardware was 6 years old and hopelessly outmatched by the likes of Famicom, MSX, and Sega's SG-1000. And speaking of SG-1000, that's a perfect example of the lack of region locking in early vintage consoles. It didn't need it. The system never left Japan. But Nintendo was serious about making Famicom a hit overseas, given how popular Donkey Kong and other arcade titles had been in the US. America would be the company's first international push for the Famicom, followed by Europe. And in fact, the European version of the console was essentially the US model that output video in PAL format. The Famicom's region locking initially seemed to come about almost incidentally. When the system became the NES, the company adapted its cartridge design for the requirements of the new market. Famicom carts are almost exactly the size of a tape cassette, but NES games were meant to sit on shelves alongside VHS tapes to disguise their video game-ish nature. NES carts ended up being physically much larger than Famicom carts due to this conceptual change. Not only that, but the NES's sleek redesign, with its ability to hide an inserted cartridge beneath a discrete flap, caused Nintendo to rearrange the system's expansion capabilities. Expansion contacts contained in the Famicom's cartridge slot shifted around to be hidden in a panel on the NES's underside. This in turn meant NES carts didn't simply have a different shape than Famicom carts, they had a different pinout too. While this could be circumvented to a degree with an adapter, like the ones Nintendo built into certain NES cartridges, it nevertheless prevented casual players from buying games from other regions and simply slamming them into their console. The NES region locking took a more sophisticated form as well. Nintendo had unwittingly left the Famicom market open to the same third-party race to the bottom that undermined the Atari 2600 and caused the US console market to crash in the early 80s. Determined to re-exert some control over the platform, they launched the Disk System expansion in Japan in 1986, and at the same time, they designed a special security chip for the American and European console called the 10NES. The 10NES chip simply looked for a simple chunk of code on startup before it would launch a game. And Nintendo's exclusive possession of that code prevented third parties from being able to run their games on the console, at least until Tengen reverse engineered it. However, the 10NES security code varied by region. The US and Canada were coded as NTSC, the UK, Australia, and Italy were designated PAL-A, and the rest of Europe was coded as PAL-B. Unless the 10NES specifically found on-cart security codes to match the console's region, it would fail to launch even a properly licensed and distributed game. While this didn't have too much impact on cross-importing between the Americas and Europe due to their incompatible video standards, it definitely served to arrest the pollination of games within Europe. The late model NES revision, the one with the dogbone controller, dropped the 10NES. The chip turned out to be a logistical nightmare, since physical wear and even dust could prevent the system from recognizing carts, which resulted in the famous blinking screen of death. Still, the philosophy Nintendo laid out with the NES's lockout features set the tone for the future of the console business. The competition took notes from Nintendo's book immediately. Sega transformed the Mark III console into the Master System in 1986, and in the process they created a physical incompatibility between the two consoles' cartridge slots. On top of that, they also integrated a lockout feature into the Master System's built-in operating system that prevented Japanese games from running even with a physical adapter. NEC took a more subtle tack when transforming the PC Engine into the TurboGrafx-16. Both systems ran game off the same credit card-sized HuCard chips, but the cards used different and incompatible pinouts depending on the region. Again, physical adapters existed to complete those scrambled connections. A pretty easy task, really, since NEC literally just reversed the pin order between regions. When the console's CD-ROM expansion launched, however, things got a lot trickier. Both the Japanese Super CD-ROM 2 and the American Turbo CD required special Super System HuCards in order to operate, and as games advanced in complexity, they required more sophisticated system cards to match. These system cards, without which CD games simply wouldn't boot, were locked by region to their corresponding hardware, meaning the only realistic way for American fans to enjoy the copious wonders of PC Engine CD games was to import a Japanese console. SEGA used a similar approach with the Mega Drive and Genesis. Those variants of the company's 16-bit hardware used a physical lockout for their cards. And while it wasn't any real trouble to insert a Genesis card into a Mega Drive or vice versa, the consoles incorporated a small tab that slid into a specific slot on the cartridges when the power switch was activated. This tab made it impossible to power on a console with a foreign card inserted, meaning Genesis importers had to hack off the tab. And even then, some games would run region checks. Nintendo used an even simpler variant of the same concept for both Super NES and N64. The business ends of those cartridges had small slots that differed by region, which had to be seated over ridged tabs molded into the console interior, meaning that a region mod involved console butchery. Though the results were hidden by cartridge flap, so it's not like anyone would ever notice. Nintendo also integrated its own region checks into games. Even if you had access to a television or monitor capable of operating on the appropriate standard, UK games simply wouldn't work on US systems, and vice versa. A region check in software would prevent games from launching on foreign systems. Of course, the Genesis had one difference from the Super NES, a CD-ROM add-on similar to the Turbo CD. And as with the Turbo CD, the Sega CD used hard region locking within the CD hardware. You could mix and match regions with the console and CD-ROM add-on hardware, but CD-based games demanded a matching CD-ROM drive. Interestingly though, the other early CD-ROM systems didn't impose such limitations. The CDI, 3DO, and Jaguar were totally open consoles. For that matter, it doesn't appear that Atari ever produced a region-locked console. That includes their portable system, the Lynx. Indeed, until the Sony PSP and Nintendo DSi came along, there was simply no such thing as a region check within handheld systems of any kind. The Game Boy, the Lynx, the Game Gear, the Neo Geo Pocket, and the Game Boy Advance, and even the original DS, were all completely agnostic when it came to regional limitations. Only Sega's Nomad and NEC's Turbo Express imposed limitations on play, since they were simply handheld renditions of region-locked hardware. It's interesting that Nintendo, who had been the first to introduce region coding in its consoles, would take 20 years to introduce that kind of restriction in its portables. But it makes sense. Portable systems by definition were designed to travel the world and cross borders. And it would be pretty miserable for a kid to go out of country, pick up a new game to play, and be locked out by some arbitrary code. Not that such a pro-consumer approach really has ever seemed like Nintendo or Sega's driving purpose, but I can't honestly think of any other reason not to incorporate a lockout into Game Boy or Game Gear. But really, who knows? Whatever the case, Nintendo portables wouldn't adopt lockout restrictions until the DSi launched in 2010. And that seemed to be a case of the company using the rise of a new distribution platform, the eShop, to put a kibosh on the growing scourge of piracy. DSi's lockout technology was messy, to say the least. DSi enhanced games and digital purchases, both of which ran only on DSi rather than on the original DS or DS Lite, would only work on systems from a matching region. But DSi also introduced the option for publishers to incorporate region locks in games for the original DS platform as well. The thing is, though, they only adhered to those limits when played on DSi. Because the DS and DS Lite lacked any sort of lockout features in hardware, those software restrictions couldn't be applied to games running on older models of the platform. So basically, upgrading to DSi hampered the amount of software you had available to you, because there were a whole lot more DS games with DSi region lockout than there were DSi exclusive releases. Oh well. Nintendo carried that limitation forward to the 3DS family as well, where it felt a bit less like a cruel trick on early adopters. Still, it was no less frustrating for anyone who saw tantalizing Japan-only releases like the sequel to Dragon Quest Rocket Slime and longed to import them. So that's the evolution of lockouts on handhelds. Let's look back at consoles. Once the industry moved beyond the 16-bit era, first parties got a lot more serious about putting up barriers to importation. For example, both the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation implemented region locks at a system level, and both could be circumvented with various chicanery. The Saturn, for example, included a Genesis-style cartridge slot that ended up being used for RAM expansions and save memory. This slot could be exploited to work around region coding, too. Fans also discovered exploits for Saturn and PlayStation that involved tricking a console into thinking its disk lid was closed and swapping out a game from a different region once the system had completed its startup checks. Basically, you'd spin up a game from the machine's own region, which would tell the system all's well, at which point you could snag that disk, take it out, and replace it with one from any other territory. This was a really good way to screw up the internals of the machine, though, which is why some enterprising hacker invented the mod chip. Simply put, a mod chip was a region-busting device that had to be installed into the console's innards, but it would fool the machine into thinking every disk was legit. Not only disks from other regions, but also bootleg copies of games. Sony wised up though, and beginning in around 1999 began to incorporate mod chip detecting code into its games. This in turn could be foiled with certain GameShark codes, which led to a maddening dance for PS1 import fans. A new game would launch, and importers would sit and wait for a hacker to come up with a GameShark cheat to bust the new mod-breaking code. It didn't put an end to importing, or to piracy for that matter. It was just a pain in the butt. The PlayStation 2 and Xbox incorporated similar region locks, and they could also be worked around in similar ways. Nintendo's GameCube, on the other hand, used a much simpler sort of region lock, one that could be nullified by installing a physical switch into the console that would swap the console's region with the simple press of a button. However, GameCube did involve one other curious and unique form of region detection. Its memory cards were tied to regions. Although you could use any card in a console from any region, once the card had been formatted in a GameCube, it would be tied to that specific console's region until it was reformatted. Nintendo's next two consoles, Wii and Wii U, took a more standard approach, and like their contemporaries, such as Xbox 360, they also used their internet connectivity to continue patching out exploits with mandatory software updates. While it was possible to hack or crack these consoles, doing so required the use of custom firmware that more or less burned bridges with official support. PlayStation Vita uses something similar, although Vita, like PlayStation 3, 4, and Portable, mainly uses it for piracy prevention. After PS2, Sony actually eased up considerably on region locking. Its later systems primarily used region locking within their shop services, and even those have become less restrictive with time to the point that PS4 incorporates a bare minimum restriction on shops. Interestingly, Sony does allow for some degree of region locking in its recent systems at the software level, leaving limitations to the discretion of publishers. Those opportunities have only been used a handful of times, and the highest profile example of software lockout, the Japanese version of Persona 3 Arena, which wouldn't work on American PlayStation 3s, raised such a fuss that it's no surprise devs haven't revisited it. And ultimately, we've come full circle. Nintendo's latest console, Switch, completely does away with the concept of region locking. Any Switch game from any region works on any Switch console. Not only that, but Nintendo's totally cool with the idea of you shopping for digital releases from other regions. Not only do you not have to jump through any hoops to buy, say, a Japanese game on an American Switch, many games have language options for multiple countries. The message is clear: Nintendo, any branch of Nintendo, is happy to take your money, regardless of your preferred currency. It's a welcome about-face not only for the company, but for the industry in general. Even as the balance of power in the world shifts to corporations and services like YouTube and Netflix crack down on regional distribution rights, the games industry realizes there's value in embracing the open, global nature of the world today. I, for one, couldn't be happier.